Hello, here is a survey of First Peter. I won't claim to be a Peter scholar. This is my attempt from long ago to put together a survey, but I think it does get us into the issues of First Peter. This is not exactly the same as a survey that I would assign, the kind of surveying I learned at Asbury Seminary, the Bob Traynham method, as it were. I'll tell you the points where it might differ, but I want to jump right in. So first of all, I don't usually cover author, audience. I don't usually cover that sort of thing in a survey, not in a survey assignment. But this is, I think, appropriate for me to do in this context. So who's the author of First Peter? Well, Peter is an excellent answer. Of course, there have been those who've argued that First Peter might be pseudonymous, in other words, written to convey Peter's authority, author authority, to convey Peter's authority to a later generation after Peter had passed. So there's a divide between, say, evangelical and non-evangelical scholars on this. I think almost all evangelical scholars would say that Peter is the literal author. I'm not sure what the divide is among non-evangelical scholars. Let's guess half and half, or that's probably more than that. Let's say 60-40. Who knows? Who think it's pseudonymous. But anyway, certainly the first verse wants us to read 1 Peter with Peter as the author. It says at the end, written through Silas. So the NIV says, with the help of Silas, whom I regard as a faithful brother, I've written to you briefly, encouraging you and testifying that this is the true grace of God. And so, this raises the question, what does it mean through Silas? So, for example, did Silas help Peter write it? Was he the amanuensis, or does this explain the Greek? The Greek of 1 Peter is not the easiest Greek in the New Testament. It's pretty solid Greek, and so did Silas help Peter write it, or did Silas write it pseudonymously? Is Silas writing this letter to convey Peter's voice to a later generation? I know a lot of the circles that I've read don't think that that's the best explanation here. And by the way, our own Dr. Joseph would vigorously argue against anybody who would say that someone like Peter couldn't write this Greek, or the Greek of James, for example. Greek was the lingua franca of the day, and so most people in Palestine knew Greek. Palestine had been Hellenized or Greekified for over 300 years at the time of the New Testament. And so I know this is one of Dr. Joseph's pet peeves about anybody who would say, no, Peter couldn't have written this Greek. Well, there's no basis to say that because Greek was known. Stanley Porter, of course, has argued that Jesus spoke Greek. And so probably the more dominant hypothesis that I've seen is that Silas might have been someone who helped deliver the letter. But I'll let you decide what you think if you want to dig deeper into those sorts of issues. But Silas, who I assume this is the traveling companion of Paul on his second and third journey. The ending also mentions Mark. Remember how Mark and Paul had a bit of a falling out after the first missionary journey. Well, you'll be happy to know here that Paul and Mark were not mortal enemies. In Colossians, Paul commends Mark. And so, they got reconciled at some point. Okay, so written by Peter through Silas, whatever that means. Audience. Now here we can speak more definitively. It is written to elect refugees of the diaspora in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. To God's elect, exiles scattered throughout the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, and so forth. This basically covers Asia Minor, or what is now modern-day Turkey. Pontus is in the north, Galatia is in the middle, Cappadocia is in the east, Asia is in the west, Bithynia is in the northwest, and so pretty much 1 Peter is written to all of Asia Minor. Are they real exiles? There's a guy named John Eliot. He's like the father of 1 Peter's studies, who wrote a book, Home for the Homeless, something like that. In that book, he argues that they're actually literal exiles, people who, because of their faith, for example, have maybe been exiled. I personally find this peculiar, really. I know he rules the day in First Peter studies, but I frankly think that's even weird to suggest that. I think that this is metaphorical. They are aliens and strangers in the world because their citizenship is in heaven. Something like Hebrews. Hebrews talks about how we're strangers and aliens in the world on the earth. By the way, there are interesting parallels between James and First Peter, between Hebrews and First Peter. They have a similar kind of feel in some respects. And this is one of them between Hebrews and First Peter. This aliens and strangers in the world. And First Peter really does, the feel of First Peter is that the Christian world is undergoing a significant persecution. At the very end, as we see here, we'll see in a second that the author says he's writing from Babylon, which I think is a code name for Rome. And the fact that Rome is being called Babylon, I think, suggests that the Christian world is feeling Rome breathing down its neck. And so this idea of alienation, I definitely think that the audience of Hebrews probably is feeling an intense alienation from the world in which they live because of this environment of persecution. In fact, Scott McKnight calls 1 Peter a defensive strategy. It's kind of a incoming, hunker down, assume the crash position. 1 Peter is written when the church is in a time of crisis, and it basically has a strategy of accommodation. I'm not talking about giving in to murder or adultery or moral accommodation. Basically, Hebrews seems to say, blend into the world, don't cause problems, don't make waves, don't compromise. It's not saying to compromise on your morals, but it's basically saying conform to your world as much as possible, and remember, Jesus is coming back. The judgment has begun. This is the feel of 1 Peter. In that sense, 1 Peter isn't written for all times and all places. There are Joshua times. There are take the land times. There are push forward times. 1 Peter is written for intense persecution times. And I don't mean today, man, I'm not under persecution. I'm looking out at a beach right now. I'm not under persecution right now. Any Christian in America who says they're under persecution is like complaining about a paper cut. If we knew what people in other times and places had undergone for their faith, things that people are undergoing in other times and places right now for their faith. I know missionaries who were in Yemen who had to be evacuated because of the turmoil there. There is persecution. We in America don't have it, in my opinion. So 1 Peter was written for times of persecution, and it basically says, wives, even if your husbands are unbelievers, be good wives in this culture. Slaves, if you have unjust masters, just remember Jesus was abused too, and good times are coming. And so 1 Peter's a kind of hunker down message, a defensive strategy. And so this idea that we are aliens and strangers in the world, they were really feeling it in 1 Peter times. Now, I do think they're Gentiles, personally, because of this quote, once you were from the Old Testament, once you were not a people, but now you are a people. Now, I really think that because Christianity and Judaism have parted ways, that we read something like this and we think, it could apply equally to Jews and Gentiles. So you could say, you Jews were not a people, but now you are a people because you've become a Christian. I personally think that's anachronistic. I really think that we don't read a book like 1 Peter the way that it would have been read in the first century. Where the question of whether Gentiles could be in the people of God or not was a fresh issue. I mean, when you read Galatians 2, when you read Acts 21, which was dated to, Acts 21 takes place about 58, you realize that this Jew-Gentile issue was a very hot issue for the first generation of Christians. And so To say once you were not a people, but now you are, it's very hard for me, especially on the lips of Peter, it's very hard for me to hear that and not think that this is referring to Gentiles. Now, there are people who disagree, but I think that if we really could get our anachronistic assumptions of what of the parting of the ways that happened and get back into the head of the earliest Christians, it would be very difficult not to hear this as a reference to Gentiles. Could be wrong, but moving right along. So what's the point of origin of 1 Peter? It says it was written from Babylon. Now there are some commentaries who think that this is literal, that Peter actually went to Babylon, which is possible because Jews had been in Babylon since the Babylonian captivity. Not all of them came back. The Talmud, the primary version of the Talmud, is from Babylon. And so it's possible. However, I think it's much more likely that this is a cipher, a code for Rome. We know from another Jewish writing called the Sibylline Oracles that Jews referred to Rome by the term Babylon. The question, of course, is when. When did they start referring to Rome as Babylon? Was it after the destruction of the temple? Because Babylon destroyed Jerusalem, Rome destroyed Jerusalem. I mean, that's a possibility. But if you go with that, then 1 Peter couldn't have been written by Peter because Peter died before the Jerusalem temple was destroyed. Then it would have to be pseudonymous, say written by Silas or somebody. But of course, let me backtrack a little. According to tradition, Peter died during Nero's reign, and Nero died in AD 68. So here's a hypothesis. Again, I'm not going to die for it. It's kind of a strange hypothesis. But let me just throw it out there. Is it possible that the Jews might have started calling Rome Babylon during the Jewish War, which began in 68? If so, then that would create a little window where Rome was, during Nero's reign, Rome was attacking Jerusalem and Judea at least, but Nero was still alive. So you could create a little window there from 66 to 68, during which Peter writes one of his, this would have to be very late then in Peter's life, and it would be before Nero committed suicide, if he did. Of course, you could just say, well, Rome had always been a problem, and so maybe Jews had been calling Rome Babylon, or maybe Peter came up with it. But you could say that 1 Peter was written in the early 60s. Say, well, maybe Peter died after the fire of Rome when Nero was putting people to death. We really don't know for sure when 1 Peter was written. Okay, well, I'd ask for questions, but you can't ask them. Or you can ask them, but I can't hear you. Okay, so now we get to the survey proper of 1 Peter. So when I do a survey, I pray, ask the Lord to help my mind see stuff. 2, I read through the text several times, maybe read 1 Peter 3 times. And then I give titles to the chapters. Of course, the chapter divisions are medieval. They're not original. But the purpose of this is to get a sense of what's there, and then I'll come up. The next step is to come up with your own outline. So we start off with the chapter titles, which is kind of like a starter outline to get us going, so that we can get acquainted with the content. So here are my titles that I gave once upon a time to the chapters of 1 Peter. Normally I also do a sentence to capture some odds and ends, but when I did this particular PowerPoint, I didn't do the sentences. So chapter 1, salvation's coming. It is a salvation about to be revealed, I believe, verse 10. Concerning this salvation, that's not it. I have very small print here I'm looking at. Well, salvation is a coming. It's a salvation that will come at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So salvation's coming. Submit to authorities, chapter 2. This is where he tells not only to submit to the emperor, but also for slaves to submit to masters. And then suffer as a good person, not as a wicked one. This is also the chapter where he tells wives to submit to their husbands, even if they're unbelievers. Again, I see these as accommodations to the time and place of writing. So a world in which you can get rid of slavery is a better world than, it's a more heavenly world. It's more like the kingdom if you can get rid of slavery, and we did, or at least we tried. There's still some loose ends to clear up, I'm afraid. But in the 1800s, the United States did away with slavery. Now, believe me, there were people, there were Christians, there were the Princeton Calvinists who argued, hey, abolition isn't biblical. They said, look at this verse, slaves obey your master. We can't get, slavery is not the problem. If there's a problem, is we just need to make sure that masters are Christian to their slaves. Well, I think most of us look back and we think the United States become a little bit more kingdom-like than it started out. That is, America became a little bit more Christian after the Civil War when we did away with slavery. And so this is what I mean by seeing 1 Peter as a defensive strategy. When we did away with slavery, we made the United States more Christian. We made it more like the kingdom of God. We made it a little bit more like heaven. And so this idea of stick to the status quo is not necessarily more, in the vast scheme of time, it's not more Christian. It may be more Christian for a particular time and place. Same thing with chapter 3 with the instruction about wives and husbands. I would argue that in heaven they neither marry nor are given in marriage, that basically a world in which wives are equal to their husbands is a world more like the heaven than a world in which wives are subject to their husbands. Of course, by the way, these are all middle voice commands in 1 Peter. And so it puts it in the slave and the wife's court. It's wife, choose to submit yourself, as it were. Slave, choose to submit yourself. This is not a master dominate your slave or husband dominate your wife. That's not how it's worded. It's worded as slaves, choose. Wives, choose. Be like Christ. It's an interesting perspective that Christ did not have to suffer. Christ did not have to submit to the Romans or to Pontius Pilate. Christ chose. Christ was the one in power. Christ was the one who chose to submit himself. And so in 1 Peter, it's the slave that chooses to submit him or herself to the master. And it's the wife that chooses to submit herself to the unbelieving husband. I think that does change it a little bit, even in the time and place of 1 Peter. So, chapter 3, suffer as a good person, not as a wicked one. Chapter 4, the judgment has begun with the household of God. And if it's this bad for us, man, it's going to be bad for the world. So that again, it gives you a sense of the feel and the flavor of 1 Peter. 1 Peter was written for a time of intense persecution. And then lastly, cast your cares upon God because he cares for you. Okay, so there's a little run through of the basic content of 1 Peter. Okay, outline. So pray. We read it several times. We give titles to the chapters. Now we're going to outline it. We're going to say, okay, the guy that did the chapters, we can do better. And now we're going to outline. So most ancient letters began with a prescript, kind of a greeting. Hi, I'm Peter. You're all over Asia Minor. Hello. May grace and peace be multiplied to you. And of course, a conclusion, closing greetings there at the end of 1 Peter. I have it beginning with verse 12, so it's a very small section, through Silas, that part of it. Mark greets you, which suggests that Mark is often associated with Rome. Of course, the Gospel of Mark is often thought to be Peter's notes from Peter's sermon, as it were. Then we have kind of this introductory part. Many letters began with a kind of introduction. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ in his great mercy, and so forth. Well, there's the verse that I was looking for earlier. To inheritance kept in heaven for you. Anyway, okay, coming of salvation that is ready to be revealed in the last time. Okay, then we have the body of the letter. Now, the body of the letter is the most unique part of the ancient letter, although there's rich meat in the beginnings and endings as well. But the real heart of the letter is in this body of the letter. So I've divided up the middle of the letter into three sections as well. I've called the first section "Live up to what you are, be what you are, live what you are, what you be," and then "Suffering for doing good." This kind of defensive strategy section. We deal with submitting to the emperor, submitting to masters, submitting to husbands, and so forth. And it's one thing to be punished for doing bad. I mean, if you steal something, and you get caught and you pay some sort of penalty, that's fine. That's appropriate. First Peter encourages its audience, if you're going to get punished, be punished unjustly. Don't be punished because you actually did something wrong. That's a different perspective, isn't it? By the way, 3:15 has that famous apologetics verse, "Be ready to give an account to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you." You can see, even by the video so far, that this is not about be ready to argue that atheist into a hole. Show your superior intellect. That's not what it's about. It's about being hauled in to court because you're a Christian. And it's not about logical argument primarily, I don't think. It's about witnessing, I believe in Christ, he's coming back. It's testifying, I have hope in salvation. It's not so much a logical, cognitive thing. It's a witness. It's a testimony, really, that you're testifying as you were persecuted. And then commit yourself to the faithful Creator by doing good. So, again, this plays into that. I like Scott McKnight's suggestion in his commentary on 1 Peter that this is a defensive strategy of sorts. Okay, so there you have my outline. This is a visual outline. I like these. If you wanted to put it in a normal Roman numeral outline, this would be Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 2, 3, 4, and then under Roman numeral 3, this would be capital A, capital B, capital C, so forth. I like to be able to see the whole thing myself. Okay, so you've prayed, you've read it several times, you've titled the chapters, you've done an outline. So the next question is, well, what is the relationship between these sections? Presumably they're not just on their own. Presumably this flows into this, flows into this. How do the different parts relate to each other? Well, you start off with the easy ones. The introduction introduces. Okay. And the conclusion concludes. Okay. And now I will say that the close has a general statement that captures Peter's understanding of what he's been doing. He says in verse 12, "I have written to you briefly, encouraging you and testifying that this is the true grace of God." So 1 Peter is meant to encourage. This is a general statement that in the conclusion that's meant to encourage all of these Christians in the time of persecution and to testify, to give an answer of how gracious God is even in a time of suffering. Okay, so there are some relationships, more relationships. So cause-effect. Given that this is the situation, live in this way. So if 1, 3 through 12 gives us an opening kind of introduction, by the way, within that introduction, I think there's a contrast between the audience's current situation and their future one. We find this, I think, throughout 1 Peter, that there's a contrast between the now and the not yet. They're living in the now, but they should have hope because of the not yet. But given this contrast, the rest of the letter, the body of the letter, tells them to adopt certain attitudes toward the present and toward the future. So there's kind of a logical consequence or a logical cause-effect relationship between this introduction and the body of the letter. So how does that play out? What are the particulars of this? Well, the live this way in this first part focuses on the kind of earthly character that fits with the hope. We have this hope of where we're going. We need to live like where we're going. We need to be holy, for God is holy, because in the future, that future world is a holy place. We need to live a life that's different from the life of the world, from the pagan way. This reminds us of James, by the way, the two different realms, living like the world that's coming. This way is the way of Christ. It's a way that leaves us as aliens on the earth. Then the second part gives us some model earthly behavior during this time of persecution. this hunker down time, which involves submission to worldly authority, slaves submitting to masters even when they're oppressing, women submitting to their husbands even when they're not believers, and living in harmony with each other and conducting ourselves virtuously in general. We're being as virtuous as we can be at this time. And then finally, accept your current lot, and their current lot is suffering. So accept it. It's not God's will for you to overthrow Jericho at this time and place. Humble yourselves under God's mighty hand. Cast your cares upon him. That's how to live in this current time. Okay? So that covers, I think, most of a survey of 1 Peter. There was one other recurring theme that I didn't feel like I had captured by looking at the structure and the relationships. It seems like while looking at the relationships between the parts of the outline, I was able to capture most of the the main patterns. But here's one that I didn't mention. Throughout 1 Peter, Peter substantiates the advice he is giving by comparing the sufferings of the Christians of his day to the sufferings of Christ. So this was more of a thread. So when I do a survey, what do? I pray, I read it, say 3 times, I give titles to the chapters, I outline it, I look for relationships between the parts of the outline. By the way, then I ask questions. This is something I haven't done in this PowerPoint. I ask questions of definition, I ask how questions, I ask why questions, I ask questions of implication. These give us an inroad into the deeper and more detailed study of 1 Peter. But in a survey, we're not wanting to get into the trees. We want to see the forest. And so relationships between the parts of the outlines and ask questions. And then lastly, what are some other threads or recurring themes that I haven't caught in my survey thus far? And of course, ask questions about them too. So I would ask questions about this recurring comparison, like what exactly is being compared here? How is it compared? How does he compare them to Christ? Why does he compare them to Christ? And what are the implications? Okay, I have a phone call just in time. So this has been a survey of 1 Peter.